Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'd like to discuss the notebooks of Albert Camus. So these are notebooks that I purchased a long time ago and they've been sitting on my shelf. And I got them because I had read some Camus early on in my undergrad and I really enjoyed his works and his philosophy. I want to look at how Camus used his notebooks. How did he go through them and what did he write down? What did he find important to jot down? And why did he do it in this style? He started his notebooks at the age of 22 and he received the Nobel Prize in Literature when he was still relatively young, and he also died when he was relatively young. But we're looking at a span of about 22 years where he did keep a journal actively. And these books have been, bound and typed and translated by two different people, one of whom most people say is not the greatest. So I tried to keep all of this in perspective. So the very first thing that I noticed is that he likes to use the notebooks as a way to answer to critics for himself what he would say in a real life conversation. And I think this is kind of like the equivalent of being in a comment section maybe, or a response to someone in a live debate. But he obviously had more time to think about it, so it wouldn't quite have that initial reaction feeling of a live debate. So to give you an example, there is a critic who early on judges him for something in The Stranger. He says, concerning criticism, 3 years to make a book, 5 lines to ridicule it, and the quotation's wrong. You attribute to me an ambition to be realistic. Realism is an empty word. And he goes on and on. But it's just like there's a lot of these moments where you can tell that he wishes he could respond to someone. I sort of nicknamed these shower thoughts. Like, when you're in the shower and you're like remembering a conversation you had like 10 years ago, and you're like replaying it and answering the way you wish you had. There's a lot of moments of that in his notebooks. To be honest, these responses are usually some of the longer chunks in these notebooks. The second thing we encounter in these notebooks are early prototypes or working through his books that are to come. So it's kind of like a literary workbook that way. You start to see these early seeds for The Plague and The Stranger and what he wants to do with it. And he does put a little bit of intent behind some of his lines. So he says, I want to do this because it would show this. And then he has 2 drafts going on at the same time. This is before the sort of death of the author concept. And I think it does still matter in many ways. I think a lot of people, when they love a writer, they do want to trace it and see their creative process. And I think that's what these notebooks are great for. Like, you don't necessarily have to say, oh, well, this is what Camus wanted to do with his work, if it didn't show up in the final work itself, and you can't read it without knowing that piece of information. I agree with that, but it is a great work to show you his creative process and the way his thoughts kind of line up and how he put these elements in his final work and how they initially came to be. And then you can look at the way he refines them and cuts down, because one of the highlights of his works are the fact that they really pack a punch in such a short work. So it is fascinating if you like to trace sort of the creative process, and I think you see a lot of that in here. The third way he kind of uses these notes is close reading, or not even close reading, but thoughts on other authors and other philosophers, and he would extract quotations from them. So sometimes when it's just something that's interesting to him, he will write down a quote from an author, so you'll know who it is, but he'll just give you the quote or write it for himself, like, oh, that was kind of an interesting thought, here's an interesting line. But you can tell that if he intends to write about it in a future essay and incorporate that, he actually writes down the page number as well, so that he can refer to it later and actually sort of cite it or put it in context. So you can tell kind of the difference between, oh, this was sort of interesting versus I'm gonna use this in an essay. There are a lot of elements in these notebooks where he also reflects on how he thinks and feels about a topic. Here's where I stand on this issue and topic that others are talking about in public. And you don't know if he's refined it and published anything yet, but you can see the back end and how he's thinking through these. Another way he uses his notebook is to organize himself or his to-do list. There are moments in here where you can see what he's been working on, what's on his mind. There is a page in here, for example, where he outlines the program for himself. So this is April 1948 to March 1951 notebook, and then he puts program February to June. He needs to work on The Rope and The Rebel, finish up 3 volumes of essays, and then he sort of divides them up per month. So between March and April, he's going to finish The Rebel. By May, he's going to work on essays. In June, he's going to go over versions of The Rope and The Rebel. And then he's going to rise early, shower before breakfast, cigarettes before noon. And, you know, lastly, because it is Camus, you do get to see a lot of kind of inner dialogue with concepts that are bigger and out there at his time. So, you know, he says, you know, those who reject suicide must also reject murder. So what do you make of war? And how does this fit into nihilism? He also sort of distances himself from some people while agreeing with some of their other concepts. Like, I do wonder how Camus would fit into the contemporary landscape right now with the personality that he had and with his thoughts. Because I think it's very hard now to have nuanced opinions without saying one line that sounds a little bit too right-wing and saying one line that sounds a bit too liberal, and then people trying to pin you down into one political box because you didn't agree 100% with exactly what they said. Like, there's something about Camus that's just kind of like drifting between all of these ideologies, and he kind of stands alone in many ways. One of the things that fascinates me most about these notebooks too is that I wish I would have seen the facsimile of his actual handwritten notes. I think it'd be interesting to see if he crossed things out as he went along. I think those are important, and it tells us a lot about a notebook in general. And I did try to find handwritten versions of these notebooks online, and it was really difficult. I couldn't really come across any of them. But I do think tracking that does tell us something about the way his thoughts worked as he was writing them down. Another essay that I found recently that I really want to read you some excerpts from is from Susan Sontag, Against Interpretation and Other Essays, probably one of her most famous. There is an essay here entirely dedicated to Albert Camus and his notebooks. And she seems kind of disappointed with this stoic sort of attitude towards his own personal notebooks. She says, you know, he's kind of like a literary husband in that way because he's there with you, he's steady. In a world filled with drama queens and nihilists in the world of philosophy, it's kind of reassuring to have this very handsome man from Algeria who is a philosopher and handsome and rugged around the edges, look you straight in the eye and say, it's gonna be okay. Like, yes, the world is absurd and it's all bad, but that's okay, and you don't need to worry about it. Like, where someone like H.P. Lovecraft likes to explore the feelings of the fear of the unknown, Albert Camus likes to say, just accept the unknown. Just be okay with that fear. It's gonna be okay. And then when you have someone like this, you want to get to know him closer. But Sontag says, you know, I'm very disappointed in these notebooks because I wanted to get a closer look at this person who had this very exciting life. And instead, we didn't get any of that. We didn't get any of the exciting things. We didn't get any of the intimate details of his soul. Like, we didn't get to that point. Instead, he's very cold and distant. And she has this amazing line. I'm going to put a few on the screen, but the first one is, impersonality is perhaps the most telling thing about Camus' notebooks. They are so anti-autobiographical. He had an exciting life, and none of that is in the notebooks. A writer's journal must not be judged by the standards of a diary. The notebooks of a writer have a very special function. In them, he builds up piece by piece the identity of a writer to himself. And lastly, and I really like this one too, Camus writes about himself only as a solitary reader, voyeur, sun and sea worshipper, and walker in the world. In this, he's being very much the writer. Solitariness is the indispensable metaphor of the modern writer's consciousness. And I thought that was kind of like a beautiful way to put a cap on it. Kind of taking all of this into consideration, I wanted to back up a bit and again try to see how him and his notebooks would fit into contemporary times. And I think a lot of contemporary writers use other things as outlets that they don't need to put into their personal notebooks per se. other than maybe drafts. So a lot of contemporary writers have live blogs, live journals, where they're connecting with their readers almost every day, so that they know if they have a secret personal message that they want to put into their work, or an answer to a critic or something like that, they can easily access their own audience and let them know what they think via a blog post or a tweet or something, where it's easy to communicate these things, unlike Camus. One that comes to mind is John Scalzi has this series of essays and articles in his blog posts that he's repeatedly putting out, and he's very close to his community, and he has an entire blog that he's very active on. But occasionally he will collect some of what he thinks are his best essays, and he'll put them in a collection and publish it as that, and they're a little bit more cleaned up and refined, but he gets to select what are some of his best thoughts or best essays, or things that did well probably, or he could already gather the popularity of the readership of that particular essay and then select that one for final publication in print. So the one that I'm thinking of right now is one I've read a few years ago called Don't Live for Your Obituary. Another thought that I had was about the idea of putting on this voice for a notebook writer or a diary writer. And in this, I think I've seen Zadie Smith talk about it in her collection, Feel Free. There is an article in there about writing, and she writes in that one, the dishonesty of diary writing, the voice you put on for supposedly no one but yourself. I found that idea so depressing. I feel that life has too much artifice in it already without making a pretty pattern of your own most intimate thoughts. Then she tried to write kind of like Virginia Woolf and just explain her reaction to talking to another writer, for example, and it took like 12 pages to write just about her encounter with another author. And then she kind of reflects on that a bit more and says, who is this for? What is this voice? Who am I trying to kid? Myself? I realize that I don't want any record of my days. When it comes to life writing, the real honest diaristic words and all, the only thing I have to show for myself is my email account. Of putting those thoughts side by side, it does make me wonder if Camus' notebooks only work for a particular time in history and their publications from that time specifically, and how things along the way have changed the idea of a notebook, or what would be relevant for an author to place inside of their private notebooks. This isn't a very organized video. I'm just kind of thinking out loud and examining his notebooks as I saw them. But I would really want to hear from you. Like, if you've read these, what did you think? Is it something you revisited more than once? That's what I'd like to know. I think I intend to send these to somebody right now who might enjoy them. And maybe he will be able to do something more with them in a way that's a bit more wholesome and more from a philosophy angle than I can. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in a future video. Bye!